We start this year with a study of the American Revolution. The years 1763 through 1775 mark a period of time just prior to the Revolution. So what were the colonies like during this time? First, one must remember that in the 18th century, a large percentage of the British colonists were proud to belong to the British Empire. Second, it's fair to say that by 1763, the American colonies had achieved tremendous integration with the empire and thus didn't forget about their Britishness. And lastly, on average, Americans had the highest standard of living in the world. This statement is supported by the fact that due to a drop in prices of British goods, American consumers had many choices. In addition, the possibility of land ownership in most areas was far better than that in Europe. The concept of salutary neglect also impacted colonial life. Between the years 1713 and 1763, American colonies saw reduced government intervention in its affairs. The belief was that if the colonies were left alone to run themselves with minimal oversight, they would produce more wealth, trade, prosper, and cause less trouble. The British focus was on major wars in Europe, so the colonies were left to raise, equip, and train their own militia for whatever protection it believed was needed against the Indians. Thus, the colonies had to develop self-reliance. So the colonies emerged with 13 separate colonial governments, sometimes undercutting the authority of Parliament. The colonial government became more effective than Parliament in some ways, due in part for being more responsive to local needs. This in turn translated to Americans becoming more used to regulating their own affairs without significant interference. Throughout this period, American manufacturing increased despite British policies to protect British manufacturers, and smuggling became rampant as British oversight became less intense. So why did the policy of salutary neglect come to be? That question can be answered in part because of Whig ideology. The Whigs believed that concentrated power leads to corruption and tyranny. They also placed an emphasis on balanced government where legislature would check the power of the king. This political group had championed government reform in England in the late 17th century and prevailed when Parliament emerged as the most powerful element in British policies after the Glorious Revolution. Another point to keep in mind was that protesting against the empire and its colonial practices were present, especially during the Regulator movement of 1771. This event began with farmers in North Carolina who were frustrated with British tax policies, inadequate representation of Western farmers in the colonial assembly, and legislation favoring wealthy planters in the East. Fighting lasted for 3 years. The most noteworthy violence took place during the Battle of Alamance, in which a colonial militia defeated the Regulators at Alamance Creek with nearly 4,000 men taking part in the conflict. So what about economic practices? How did this shape the American colonies? The underlying system in place was called mercantilism. It was a policy which maintained that the colonies existed for the benefit of the mother country. This meant that colonies should add to the empire's wealth, prosperity, and self-sufficiency. Therefore, colonists were viewed as tenants who were expected to grow tobacco and other necessary products without troubling the colonial administration, which in part would foster self-government and agricultural experimentation in the colonies. Again, the colonies existed to benefit Great Britain. They were to ensure British naval supremacy by furnishing ships, ships' stores, sailors, and trade. They, the colonies, also provided large consumer market for British manufactured goods. They also kept wealth in the form of gold and silver in the empire by growing cash crops like sugar that would otherwise have to be purchased from foreigners. To support and enforce mercantilism, England passed the Navigation Laws, first enacted in 1651 to discourage Dutch shippers who were becoming active in American trade. Some of the basic provisions of the Navigation Laws passed in the 17th and 18th centuries by England include restricting commerce to and from the colonies to England or American vessels. Certain items, such as tobacco, couldn't be traded or shipped to any other foreign market except England, despite prices, meaning potential profit, which may be higher in other markets. All European goods going to America had to go through England first. The acts also placed certain restrictions on colonial manufacturers in regards to export. The British didn't want to have competition with her colonies. Two such restrictions forbade the exportation of woolen cloth produced in America and beaver hats. Further British restrictions encouraged colonists to produce pig and bar iron, but specifically prohibited the building of any new steel furnaces, slitting mills, or plating forges. The last significant navigation law was the Molasses Act of 1733, which imposed heavy duties on all molasses, rum, and sugar imported from the French Caribbean colonies. This was significant because the colonies traded heavily with the French West Indies. Some of the rum consequently produced in America was traded for slaves. New England merchants were very heavily involved in the slave trade. Now let's look at both the positive and the negative aspects of mercantilism. Here are some positives. Until 1763, navigation laws were not an intolerable economic burden on the colonies. The colonies had rights of Englishmen and unusual opportunities or self-government. The colonies enjoyed British military protection free of charge. Colonies greatly profited from manufacturing and trading. Here are some of the negative components or impact of mercantilism. The colonial economy did not develop as quickly as it wanted to, especially in regards to manufacturing. Think of the vast landscape rich with raw materials. Southern colonies were hit hard as prices for exports dropped by being restricted to only English markets. For much of the colonial period, the southern colonies were favored by the British in her policy making because of the cash crops produced there, including tobacco, sugar, and rice. This favoritism caused New Englanders to grow resentful. Lastly, mercantilism was negative, with the British imposing the writs of assistance. These British writs were search warrants used by English custom officers to harass colonial ships. What were the motives? To reduce colonial smuggling, such as the illegal triangular trade routes taking place, which circumvented the tariffs and the trade restrictions placed on the colonies by the Crown. In 1761, James Otis, a young Boston lawyer, demanded that Parliament repeal the acts. Parliament refused, but Otis's efforts gained press throughout the colonies. It was Otis who later wrote the famous battle cry, "No taxation without representation."